Hello there. We've not really done a tech update for you this season, and we're almost halfway through the 2024 Formula 1 season. So we thought we'd go through all of the top teams and have a look at some of their tech updates throughout this season and go through some of the trends as well. And we're going to start off with the Mercedes. Now, as we all know, it came with a very, very distinct front wing at the start of the season with this kind of legality strip, if you like, and that is basically acting as the fourth element. All Formula 1 front wings must have four elements in their entirety. So you had the sort of bigger, thicker inboard section here, and then that developed into an extra front wing element on the other side of the adjuster flap here. So what you can see is, as I've already sort of labelled out, this very, very thin strip here. It's not a gurney flap, it is actually an extra distinct element. And then you have the proper top flap here, and it sort of concaves down, and you get this detached tip here. Now, you might be kind of wondering, is that legal? Is it something that teams are able to do? And it's something that Mercedes did check with the FIA beforehand. Pat Simmons spoke about it in pre-season testing, said, yeah, it was within the bounds of legality, but was it something that it wanted to encourage Formula 1 teams to do? And part of the reason for doing this was because Mercedes found that the balance of its car, particularly at the start of this season, there was a tendency to kind of have low speed understeer and oversteer at high speeds. And so this was one of the things that they were trying to dial out with this front wing. And so by unloading the kind of middle portion, if you like, that was helping it out. The byproduct of that is that detached tip here. So basically, it's almost like what we had pre the current set of regulations, where you had those detached tips on the front wing end plate. And so because you've got this sort of like high pressure area on the top, and then underneath you've got this low pressure area, you've got airflow that's basically sort of being disturbed by this tip, and it kind of wants to go from the high pressure area to that low pressure area, and so you get that sort of rotation of airflow there. And that's what creates your kind of vorticity, basically. So yeah, you end up with a sort of nice little vortex here that you can use to manage flow around the front sort of tire. You can send it to the back of the car and energize your airflow that way. It's kind of up to what the aerodynamicists need to do, but that's obviously changed now. So Mercedes has changed the balance of its car quite a lot over the start of this season. It's made a few floor upgrades. It's made a few upgrades to after the car as well. And so this front wing wasn't really needed anymore. It didn't really need to sort of provoke a certain effect. The car's a lot more stable. Particularly kind of in corner balance is pretty good. Out of corner it's struggling a little bit still, but as you can see, there's quite a sort of big change here, and you have these four very distinct front wing elements. So you have this one here, that's your second element there, we have the third element here, and then we have a more generic, let's say, fourth element here. It's not really generic, obviously. There's a lot of time and research and development that goes into these front wings, but it's a lot more conventional, what we would say. And so you have your sort of flap adjuster mechanism here, and you kind of like to expose that a little bit. Again, you're creating a little bit of vorticity and energizing a little bit of airflow there. It's kind of acting like a sort of like little vortex generator fin almost. But the interesting part actually is probably on the outside here. You can see where the wing kind of ebbs away, and you have these almost detached attachment points, if you like. And so yeah, you can sort of see that gap, that distinct gap here. You can see that very, very thin element here. I'm just covering it up there, but that thin element here that's basically satisfying legality where it needs to attach to the front wing end plate. And so again, you're able to use exposed tips and that kind of geometry to generate vortices. There's a lot of focus on getting airflow outside the front tires like this. There's a lot of effort put at the start of 2022 to try and 2021 when the development of these regulations to kind of stop that, because a lot of cars were doing that in the previous rule set, and it does create a lot of what we would call dirty air, a lot of turbulence. It just makes it a lot harder for the cars behind to kind of actually get close and have their front wings and the rest of the aero working effectively, which is kind of why we call it dirty air. It's very, very turbulent. Cars aren't designed to work in it. They're designed to work in a lot more kind of laminar airflow. So that's kind of the issue there. Obviously, teams don't want to, work with that. They're in it for performance. They're not there to create an effect, let's say. So you get this outward direction of airflow around the front tyre. And so it's basically mitigating the amount of wake that you're getting off of the front tyre that's going down the floor and disturbing all of their lovely aerodynamics. So that's part of the reason behind it. You can also see here, I'm just going to circle it here, this tiny little flap here. Again, that's to enhance the effect there at the front end. So that's kind of Mercedes front wing updates. I think it's probably one of the more visually interesting updates that we've seen this season. It was a big change in the team's ethos. It sort of looked like they'd come up with something very, very unique, but they've rolled back from that just simply because the car didn't really need it anymore. They're getting the rear end to work a little bit better, and so you need to balance that with the front, and obviously you're taking a little bit more downforce from, having a much more inboard loaded front wings. So just going to have a look at the Ferrari next, and it's kind of had two phases of upgrades, if you like. It had a sort of relatively large upgrade package in Imola, and we've just had one in Spain as well. So the sort of two pinch points of the European season sort of starting and then not starting and then starting again. We're actually into the proper European season now. This is a shot from Imola here. It was a big switch to a kind of overbite side pod inlet here. That's sort of following in the footsteps, I guess, of what Red Bull had turned up to the start of the season with, what McLaren had also turned up to the start of the season with. We're also, slightly different engine cover profile as well. So there's been a lot of, actually, I'll just go on a slight tangent here, but around the halo furniture here, you have the halo here. There's been a lot of attention paid to, mitigating, I guess, the drag that comes off of it. And Ferrari has sort of squared off that fin here that you can see where the airflow is shedding off of the halo. And so because it's quite a sort of rounded, it's not a very aerodynamic shape, teams are allowed to produce fairings for it, but again, it's only sort of a slight improvement, let's say. So obviously you've got a kind of round structure, and that's going to have sort of relatively high drag coefficient because it's a lot more difficult to keep the airflow attached when you've got that sort of rear sort of bluff side, let's say. So you're using fins and that sort of thing to mitigate that. One of the other things that Ferrari brought to Imola was this sort of fin here alongside the driver, and if you look at it in profile, so I'll just sort of draw it at the side here, you've got kind of the halo structure here, driver's helmet, and got the cockpit face here, and it's sort of shaped like a little cobra almost about to pounce. And this is going to have something where you're going to get some kind of vortical structure produced, and then that can be shuffled down the car to assist with whatever you want to do with the diffuser. If you want to create certain pressure gradients, if you want to energize flow going down the side pods and improve the efficiency again of your diffuser. It kind of depends what a team wants to do with their aero maps. You can see this cooling exit here. It's always really difficult to design a cooling exit because you've just got a load of sort of relatively untamed hot air just being fired out the back of a car. So that's something that you need to shape to try and get the best out of the rear car aerodynamics. You're not disturbing the rear wing too much. It's also quite important, obviously, Ferrari having the sort of the channel over the top of its side pods. And another thing that it did in Imola as well was enhance this kind of undercut as well. And again, just sending airflow to the back of the car with the least distance traveled, let's say. It is difficult with that channel because you sort of have to, I guess, splay out the sort of side of the side pod a little bit more. But as long as you can get the two to kind of coalesce and sort of energize each other, then it's not too much of a bad thing. It's very, very subtle, the change for Spain here. We don't quite have the same angle, but I'll just zoom in a little bit on the side pods. You do have a much more pronounced undercut here, so you can kind of see that here to here. So your airflow is going this way and this way over the top of the floor. And again, just trying to keep the airflow relatively energized and make sure it doesn't lose too much, because airflow can lose a lot of energy due to friction, that kind of thing. If you're sending it on a very sort of circuitous path around the car, then it's not going to be as energized as it needs to be. So that's why we have undercuts. That's why we have things like this, and that's why we have devices to energize airflow as well. So it's all part of aerodynamics rich tapestry, let's say. You can kind of see that cooling exit here as well. Ferrari as well changed its engine cover quite dramatically over the start of the season. You can see it's a lot lower, just trying to reduce the kind of footprint, let's say, with regards to drag. It's not going to have too much of an impact. Clearly, the aerodynamicists found it sort of worthwhile. And then it's basically the same from a different angle. Another thing it did in Imola was really squared off this rear wing profile. You can see that, I'll just draw sort of alongside it next to it. A profile that teams like to go for a lot is they like to have a nice straight top and then have a sort of V-shaped cutout in the center where the DRS housing is. And that's basically just to sort of bleed off the turbulence that's coming off the DRS mechanism. It's not particularly useful part of the wing when you do have that DRS piece, I guess, inside. The middle section is always the most useful part, but you're losing effectiveness because of that DRS housing. So you can afford to lose a little bit in the middle, but Ferrari have clearly found a way to get the middle working a lot more efficiently. And you can just see that, what I pointed out there, the sort of Cobra-like, I guess, winglets there, so alongside the driver. So just a little bit of a look at the Ferrari. Let's go on to the McLaren next, I think, because obviously McLaren, a lot of people were suggesting that the team is now probably the holder of the fastest car in Formula One. I think that's debatable at this stage. There's still a lot more to come from them. Red Bull seem to be performing week in, week out, and McLaren just kind of need to get back into that mojo of winning regularly and often and being a little bit more flawless with their strategies. So here's a look at basically what they did in Miami, because that was kind of their first big upgrade package of the season. You had Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri on split upgrades. So Piastri sort of had half of the updates and Norris had all of them. So we'll have a little bit of a comparison of kind of what changed between Miami, between the two drivers, and then thereafter when they both got the full upgrade package. And I think the most obvious section of that is probably around the side pod inlets. Now, like Red Bull, McLaren was the team that also started the season with a kind of overbite inlet, and so that's with the winglet on the top. But yeah, so you've got these sort of like relatively squarish side pod inlets here, and then you can sort of see how it sort of rolls into the sort of surface here, and just sort of for comparison as well, I'm going to be jumping back and forth between them because I think there's a few bits I want to show you. But here's Norris's car, and you can see immediately that these are much wider and a lot shorter. And so basically by what you're doing here is you're getting an inlet that's a little bit less disturbed by the front suspension. As you can see, this part of the wishbone is sort of quite high up. And so to ensure that you're getting a decent mass flow rate, obviously there's going to be sort of downward direction of airflow after the wishbone, but to ensure that these inlets are getting the right amount of mass flow rate to cool the engine and cool all the ancillary components, that kind of thing. This is just something that you kind of need to do sometimes. So you widen it. It does have a slight effect on the geometry of the side pods, but probably not too much of one. And so yeah, making sure that you're cooling the engine sufficiently, trying to get, actually what you do end up getting is a much bigger undercut as well. So obviously by making that sort of taller, obviously Red Bull is sort of a little bit more like, as I've drawn it, a little bit more like a letterbox, sort of recessed into the side pod. McLaren is a little bit more conventional in that regard, but clearly they've seen fit to kind of do that, and increasing the size of the undercut was a little bit more preferable to perhaps having out and out a little bit less drag coefficient overall. So that's perhaps one of the key updates, and that's part of a raft of side pod changes. Another thing is front wing as well. Go back to Piastri's car, you can kind of see this sort of relatively smooth profile here. sort of draw them out. And then you've got this spoony sort of section in the center here. It's sort of relatively, I would say, conventional, relatively sort of equal size between each of the kind of cascade-like winglets, if you like. Norris is a little bit different because I think you can probably tell there's a little bit less focus on inboard loading perhaps, and you're using a little bit more of the middle of the wing. Does seem to go up a little bit more in the center of the wing, and these sweep up a little bit more as well. Perhaps the thing you can see is that this flap here is angled down a little bit, so you're driving a little bit more front end downforce, and this spoon section in the middle is shallower and it's squarer as well. So I think that's the visual change you see. And again, this is all about shaping airflow to the rear of the car, making sure that your floor and making sure that the components basically further downstream have all got the airflow patterns that they need to work properly. So this is something that, you know, obviously when you change a front wing, either you design it so that it works with all of the other parts of the car and that there's minimal change with regards to the airflow patterns that you're putting in, or you're changing a lot afterwards. So there's quite a lot to consider, a lot to change. I think those are the key kind of updates that McLaren have brought. They've understood them pretty quickly. Obviously, Norris won in Miami, and the car is very, very strong at the moment. So moving on to Red Bull, which is, again, currently the strongest team in Formula One. How long that's going to be, we don't know. There's presumably some upgrades coming. Some improvements need to be made. So this is basically no real upgrades to kind of speak of with regards to the Spanish kind of variation of the car, but I just wanted to point out a few things. As you could say, as I was talking about, the shape of the side pods is, again, really, really extreme, and they've gone all in on that undercut section here, and you can kind of see that you have that channel here at the bottom. So this is where the inlet's around here, and it's kind of recessed in, as I say. And it's quite an interesting design, and again, it's something that they took great pains to hide during launch season. They really didn't want to show us what it was going to be like, what it looked like. They were very, very tricky with their kind of lighting and that kind of thing, so eventually we'd see it, and no team has kind of taken as an extreme a view yet, but again, it is all about maximizing that undercut, making sure that you do have that mass flow rate. And I think by cutting the size of that inlet, what they've done here is they've put another inlet on top here. Show you, yes, this one here. This kind of shows you that inlet here. So you've got a little inlet there, actually. Got an inlet here, and you've got another one here, and it's just all adding up to something that is adequately going to control the power unit temperatures and that kind of thing. So clearly sort of very interesting kind of piecemeal almost approach to doing it, putting the inlets in places that aren't particularly aerosensitive, let's say. Another part of the car that was sort of very obvious at the start was just this very kind of high shoulder. And this is something that we've sort of spoken to engineers about, because obviously it was a sort of big motif of the car when it was launched. I think we spoke to Paul Monahan about it, and he said, you know, it's not particularly aerosensitive, but it just gives you a little bit more options with regards to cooling. I spoke to James Allison about it because this is something that Mercedes had last year, and he said, you know, again, going back, you know, it doesn't really change a whole lot for the team. Again, it's just about putting your cooling demand where you need it. So this is a little look at the edge of the floor of the Red Bull. This was Bahrain spec, so it's changed a little bit since then, but again, it's just to illustrate the complexity of this kind of area of the car, all the things that sort of teams are doing. So I just wanted to kind of highlight these little flick ups here. I'll kind of draw around them as much as I can. I'm not very good at drawing, but that's all right. Yeah, you can see these flick ups here. And, you know, since we've had these regulations, we've got rid of barge boards and that sort of thing. So front tire weight control has always been a little bit difficult. We do sort of have seen teams use the side pods for that sort of thing. So again, at the start of 2022, you saw Ferrari with these very, very boxy side pods, and that was sort of part of their weight control, let's say, processes and that sort of thing. But it's also really important as well, because you don't want your tyre weight to get into the floor too much. You want to protect that floor. And so that's kind of what this is. This is a kind of twofold here. You've got some devices that are going to create vorticity along here, and then you're creating a nice kind of little barrier for your underbody aero to basically expand and do as it pleases underneath. Ensure that you're not going to interrupt it too much with any vorticity and that sort of thing, because that can change the direction of the flow and slow it down, de-energize it, so that sort of thing. But also what you're doing is you're going to get some degree of tire wake that's going to come from a little bit higher up and sort of fall down. And again, it's just flicking it up and basically getting rid of it, making sure that it doesn't fold in behind or anything like that, doesn't de-energize the whole thing, which is not what you want, because you want lots of energy, you want lots of velocity under the body. And so by Bernoulli's equation, that equates to reduced sort of pressure gradient, that sort of thing. And so you're going to end up with higher downforce production because you're speeding up the airflow. Another picture of the Red Bull I thought was interesting, actually, just from the Canadian Grand Prix this time, and you can see all the grime from a wet race. I love it when we get a wet race, because first of all you can see all the sort of tyre spray and that sort of thing. It's almost like a wind tunnel on track, let's say. You can also see the flow lines as well, and it's like basically flow vis in real time. So again, you can see their Red Bulls. This is why I brought halos up earlier. You can see Red Bull sort of efforts to mitigate things. You can see this little flick up here. You can see a little bit falling here, and you can see a little bit of airflow sort of spilling over these very high sides here and into that channel. You would think, the airflow would go straight on, but Red Bull has clearly found a way to shape that area so that it folds nicely into that channel. You can see where the rain has gone in here and it's coming out of the cooling vent. You can see all this grime here. You can also see relatively sort of straight flow across the face of the side pod. You can see a little bit, see how the airflow is folding in here and into here. So it's always super interesting. Again, as I say, it's quite fun to have the wet races to see that aspect of the car as well. So just something I thought was moderately interesting. I thought I'd talk about the Spanish Grand Prix a little bit as well, because Red Bull was beaten to pole by Lando Norris, and part of that was running a slightly higher downforce rear wing. One of the new things they brought to the Spanish Grand Prix weekend was this new beam wing. Pumped up the downforce a little bit on it to try and get a little bit more traction through the high-speed corners. An area where Red Bull has been very, very strong, but it's feeling a lot of pressure from McLaren, so it felt like it needed to improve. Quite a sort of deep rear wing as well, quite a lot of camber with it, as you can kind of tell here, quite sort of deep pan, and then you've got the upper flap here as I talk about the V-shaped section in the centre. Rear end downforce was very, very good, and if you look at the GPS data of a Red Bull lap versus a McLaren lap, it's clearly much stronger in the high-speed corners, but in the low speed as well, it's not something that it needs to find. And so again, tacking on a little bit more downforce for those corners will help generally. But I think it's mechanical, where McLaren is a lot stronger compared to the Red Bull. The Red Bull, as we know, runs very, very stiffly. It's very, very stiffly sprung. So that's something that doesn't give the car quite as much compliance. In high-speed corners, it ensures that the car is a relatively sort of stable platform. It's not rolling around quite as much, it's not diving as much, and so the downforce underneath produced by the floor is relatively consistent. But the McLaren seems to have a little bit more compliance, and so in low speed corners, just its top speed through the lower speed corners is about 5 kilometers an hour faster than the Red Bull. So clearly it's not got quite the peaks that the Red Bull has in terms of top speed, but it doesn't have the lows either, and in low speed corners, that's where the time is. Before we just get on to the final couple of slides here, we have the Aston Martin here. Aston Martin's sort of fallen off a little bit at the start of this season. Seems that, for all the world, that they just can't get their upgrades to work as timely, let's say, compared to McLaren or anyone like that. There's a few, things that the team needs to look at with regards to correlation, that kind of thing, just to make sure that everything is producing what it says it does in the wind tunnel. The other thing is as well that it just appears to have made the car a little bit harder to drive overall. So that's something the drivers are complaining about. Fernando Alonso says it can be mitigated a little bit with setup, but it's not the easiest thing to do. I just wanted to draw attention to the front wing a little bit, because it's quite a novel concept. It does look sort of quite conventional up to this point, but you've got this little V-shaped cut out here, this little crease almost. It seems to
line up with the shoulder of the tyre. So I wonder if that's an effort to pull a little bit of airflow sort of in wash that, and you have the outwash around here. You're just basically using it to kind of clear the tyre a little bit. Again, pretty conventional here. This is something that the team shortened its nose at the start of the season as well. And so it's got like a little inlet here that's usually used for driver cooling and that sort of thing. But again, it's a relatively aero sensitive part of the car, so you're going to be tinkering around with the front end to try and extract a little bit more from the car further back if you've not, let's say, done your homework and designed it the way that you expected. And then just lastly, to finish off, just wanted to kind of talk about a trend that's been sort of relatively apparent since the middle of 2023, and that's just the way that teams are using their rear wings. So when the regulations were set out in 2022, we sort of had these looped rear wings, and so they were without a conventional sense of an end plate, let's say, as you could probably see in particularly sort of like the cars in the 90s and the early 2000s, having a wing. Let's draw it like this, a wing end plate like this. You saw lots of like vortices coming off the back of it, particularly in wet weather. And so that was quite a sort of important way of drawing a lot more rear end downforce out of the car, but it was also sort of quite a draggy pursuit, let's say. And it was creating a lot of dirty air, and that's one of the things that the F1 and the FIA wanted to avoid when it came to ensuring that these cars could kind of race each other a little bit more closely. So you have this looped sort of thing. Well, you had this looped sort of thing that you don't have an end plate, so not until here, and it's not until there where it's producing some degree of vorticity, but it's not as strong as it used to be. But there are teams that have kind of exploited the regulations and have found a way to stay within the bounds of legality, but they've managed to kind of detach the tip, let's say. And you can see it on the Williams kind of example here. So this is a shot from 2023. You can see it sort of feeds in like this. And this is a shot from this year's car, 2024. You can see this wing here, and you can see this tiny little attachment point here that basically keeps the wing relatively legal. I think it's probably a little bit easier to kind of illustrate how it works on this Red Bull shot. So again, you've got quite a straight plain wing here, and then you've got a little attachment sort of somewhere in here. And again, this is basically what I was explaining a little bit earlier before. You've sort of got like high pressure on top of the wing. You can have a lower pressure underneath, and because it wants to equalize, the airflow wants to go from high pressure to low pressure. That's what creates your vorticity, because you've got air trying to go underneath, the car's moving forward, and so this edge is creating a tip vortex. Basically, that's going to strengthen the airflow over the rear wing without an end plate as well. So it's just something to be aware of. If you sort of end plate a wing, let's say, it ensures that it's producing a lot more downforce across the span of it. Without it, it means that, let's say, this part here is not quite as effective. So if you're sort of almost creating an end plate with regards, using vorticity to kind of create that effect for you, then you're just ensuring that much more of the span is useful for creating downforce and that kind of thing. That's basically the long and short of it here. And you still have this the shape of the rear wing here, but yeah, you can see how teams have kind of developed that. They've taken regulations that were intended to help produce overtaking and closer racing, but that's not where the team's interest is. So they're developing their own ways around it to try and get a little bit more performance. But yeah, there's a quick look of all the technical trends over 2024 so far. If you like it, we'll do it again. Hopefully this has been insightful and enjoyable, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.